I want to very briefly look at evolution of plants. We're going to come back to plants later on, but I want you to think primarily about how these plants had to develop and what characteristics they had to have in order really to move on to land. So green algae would have been our aquatic common ancestor to all plants, so this would have been the earliest relative that we know of. Now, to develop enough characteristics to move on to land, we've got to think about a couple of things. So what is a plant going to need to actually move on to land? Well, it's going to have to still deal with water, right? It's going to need nutrients and resources, oxygen, carbon dioxide, all of that, right? And it's going to have to find a way to reproduce. Because remember, green algae are single-celled. So they just divide and divide and divide. But if you're going to develop more complex land structures or plant structures for land, we're going to have to look at higher order development for this to happen. So most likely we look at a marine algae that was able to colonize fresh water and then shallow water and then live outside of the water for some period of time, and then the full transition onto land, which would have been our early mosses. We refer to them as bryophytes. So what do they need? Well, we talked a minute ago, they're going to need water and they're going to need other resources associated with them. They're likely going to need something to conserve or maintain water. So for most plants, we look at this as being a cuticle, typically waxy in nature. Okay. We're going to need some sort of reproductive structure or embryo that is essentially dry tolerant, right? So how do we deal with no longer being surrounded in water all the time? Everything is going to dry out on land, so how do we deal with that? And then trying to understand how we go from a single cell to multi-cell. And looking at being surrounded in water to having to acquire water somehow. Okay? So bryophytes or mosses are our earliest ones. We see these surrounding moist environments. They have to remain moist. Water is critical for mosses. There's a reason water is critical for mosses. They are short to the ground because they have no vascular tissue, meaning they can't move water up the plant. That's not going to be possible. The other thing we look at is they actually have swimming sperm. So when we look at that distinguishing characteristic, they're going to have to be around water in order to reproduce. The next step would be to add vascular tissue so we can move these plants away from the water a little bit, but we actually start out with a seedless variety in our ferns and club mosses and horsetails and so on, like the ones at the top here. So it allows them to get bigger, adding this vascular tissue, but they still have swimming sperm. So we're going to have to keep them in relatively wet areas at least part of the year so that they can reproduce. A seed is our next step. So we end up at gymnosperms and angiosperms, that you know, angiosperms being flowering plants. So that distinguishing feature of a seed then becomes very important for moving these plants even further away from the water, but also allowing a terrific movement of these plants as far as dispersal across the ground because of the seeds themselves. Now eventually we'll add fruit, but that's much later on. So very early on we're just looking at seeds. So these seed plants, as I mentioned, they'll have pollen so we can increase dispersal. They're going to need no water for fertilization at this point, so the development of seeds and so on would be possible without the presence of water. And then eventually, about 165 million years ago, we get angiosperms, or the flowering plants, and I think you know now they are by far the most dominant plants on the planet. So these derived characters that we've talked about before, the red lines here, the flowers, the seeds, the vascular tissue, okay, those are critical derived characters in order for our plants to succeed on land. Now, we will eventually, as I mentioned, bring in fruits. When we bring in fruits and seeds, of course, we want to focus on the relationship with animals. We will look later at this coevolution idea. So the coevolution meaning that two organisms dependent on one another are actually going to evolve to benefit one another in a mutualistic relationship. Okay, so attracting pollinators to the flowers, very important step for the plants, but then also we'll look at the need for the plants and animals to interact and start developing these fruit structures for the plants, because it allows them to draw in even more seed dispersers. Not only do they need pollinators, but now they need seed dispersers. You're not going to get a bee to carry a seed across a landscape for you, right? So now we need larger animals to come in and help to move these fruit and eventually the seeds, and deposit the seeds in a much greater radius than we would normally see from just wind pollinated plants. So plants, of course, do not fossilize well, but we think this may have been one of the first transitional plants from a basic vascular or fern and into a gymnosperm / angiosperm kind of thing. Okay, we see a lot of what you would probably call weeds that look a lot like this now. So thinking about this as kind of a transitional plant has been important for dating that period of time.